We still don't have a Pac-12 media deal, so what should Oregon be wanting from it? Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. If you haven't already, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, comment if you would like to. 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts. Appreciate any and all of that. Those of you watching on YouTube, see, I'm in the post-broadcast recording space. It was Southern Utah Gymnastics tonight that I was commentating. Yes, indeed. Very true. I do talk about gymnastics, and I kind of know what I'm saying. My analysts do, shall we say, the majority, the lion's share of the work, so to speak. But let's get into the show today. Starting with a question from my guy, Peyton Chiasson, I think is how his last name's pronounced. I'm sorry, my guy, if I'm butchering that, but he says, so I listened to yesterday's podcast, and I want to ask you this, and you may have already answered it, and I had forgotten. But what is your dream scenario for the Pac-12 and its new media deal? What is my dream scenario? What is my dream scenario? Well, the ideal scenario for the Pac-12 would be you go back in time, USC and UCLA stick around. You add San Diego State and SMU anyway. Maybe you go back in time and poach to SMU and Houston, add San Diego State and, like, I don't know, maybe a Fresno State or so to add to the conference, and you have it. Yeah, anyway, you see where I'm going with that, being facetious to begin. But since we are in this space where the Pac-12 doesn't have a current deal, and I think about this stuff quite often, as you may or may not know, I host Locked On Pac-12. Been talking about that basically all week. So if you want more content on it, go check it out. But for Oregon going into this deal, I'm really not that concerned. I'm really not, because here's the thing. I would love for the Pac-12 to get a media rights distribution per school payout that is in the same ballpark as the Big 12 and the ACC, which on average going forward will pay 31.6 in the Big 12 and 36 in the ACC. And that deal in the ACC runs through 2036. So I would love for the Pac-12 to be able to get in the low to mid 30s. If you're there, then you are on par with the other two Power 5 conferences that you can reasonably compare yourself to, because the Big 10 and the SEC are just in another stratosphere. That's the way this works. But even if that doesn't happen, and I'll get to the mediums for broadcasting the games in a moment. Even if that doesn't happen, let's say the Pac-12 comes in at 27 per year. Not that worried about it for Oregon. Really, really not. Because number one, it's only a few $1 million. And number two, this is not the sole source of income for a program like Oregon. There are other ways that the Ducks program generates money to have in the pool to pay coaches or upgrade facilities or go into NIL collectives, any or all of the above, or everything that goes into running a college athletics department at the Power 5 level. So if Oregon from the media rights distribution is making, I don't know, let's say it's $5 million less per year than Big 12 schools, and what would that be? 10 million less per year, or 9 to 10 million less per year than ACC schools. I do not suddenly view Oregon as not being in a place where they can keep up with those other schools financially. Now, Oregon is unique in the Pac-12 in that sense. I don't think Washington has major concerns on that front. I don't think Stanford, if they actually care about football that much, I don't know if they do down there in the farm right now, but we'll see with their new head coach. They would not have that many concerns on that front, but other programs would. The Oregon States, the Washington States of the world, the Arizona schools. I think Utah is somewhere in the middle, and Colorado is probably closer to the bottom, even with Dion there. So not concerned about Oregon on that front. I don't think that if that happens, you're suddenly going to have the Ducks just falling way behind. They'll just fall off the map and they'll never be able to compete nationally like they have for the last 15 years or so. No, not concerned on that particular front. But for the sake of the conference, I would like the other schools to have as good of a fighting chance as they possibly can, because we all know that, it's been this way for a long time. And the media deal, I think, is exaggerating as in increasing what has already been the case, which is the Pac-12 is not as strong financially or television wise as the Big Ten and the SEC. Is that a new concept to anybody? Because it's not new to me. I've been watching that happen for quite a long time. Oregon's also been in a conference, the Pac-12, that's been getting outpaid on a per team basis for a long time. I noticed we haven't really been struggling, so not worried about that. But I would like the other teams in the conference to be in that area, because if you look at the Pac-12 going forward, you want it to be as strong as you possibly can. If this is Oregon's only option. I know there are going to be people who say, let's go to the Big 12, let's go to the Big 10. Let's just assume, because it's the most likely outcome, Oregon's in the Pac-12 for the foreseeable future. You want the league to be as strong as possible. And I think Oregon, Washington, and Utah as your top three programs, that's a pretty good place to be. Now, Colorado being the fourth would be outstanding. And then you need, frankly, if I were George Kliavkoff and I could pick which 5 schools from a television standpoint would be the most successful in the next 5 years, it would be Oregon, it would be Washington, it would be Utah, it would be Colorado, and it would be Stanford. Which sounds strange, I know, but Stanford gets a lot more viewership than you think. The Bay Area is a big market. And Stanford, at its peak, as we all know very well, has been a high-level college football program that has won at a very high level. Can they do it in this new era of college football with NIL and the portal? That remains to be seen. That's the task that's ahead of Troy Taylor down there in Palo Alto. But I think that those would be the brands that you want to have highlighted the most, and then have other teams, your Oregon States, Washington States, Arizona schools, competent, and every now and then, maybe popping with a 10-win season or a conference championship game appearance and such. Anyway, bringing this back to the media rights discussion. Got a little sidetracked there, but that's okay. You're still here, and I very much appreciate that. In terms of where the games are broadcast, on a personal level, I don't care. On a conference level, I think you want to have a cable partner in some capacity. But if you're pretty streaming heavy, which is what it seems like is going to happen, but we really don't know. Anytime you see someone, myself included, say, it's going to be this % streaming, or it's going to be so streaming heavy. You don't know that. I don't know that. That person doesn't know that. Nobody knows. There are reliable sources that have said a streaming party is going to be involved in some capacity, but no one knows what it's going to be. So if you see someone, you can find ridiculous stuff everywhere where people say, oh, they're only going to have 10% of their games on cable. Nobody knows that. We don't have the deal yet. And I'm not going to sit here and say that sort of stuff. But on a personal level, I really don't care. I have Apple TV. I have Amazon Prime. Obviously, I can watch ESPN. None of that stuff is a concern for me, but it is for a lot of other people, which I'll talk about after I tell you about FanDuel. It's the midway point in the NBA season. It's here, and it's the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. New customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to the point scores and threes drain. Plus, FanDuel lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same game parlay. Go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more and secure your no sweat first bet. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. A lot of people seem to be hot and bothered about the streaming thing. I guess I understand why, but here's an important thing to consider on the streaming front. If, let's say, ESPN's partially involved, but again, just as a hypothetical, I'm not reporting anything here. This is just for the sake of this particular point I'm going to make. Let's say 60% or 70% of the Pac-12's games were on either Amazon or Apple TV Plus or some combination of the two. Being on Amazon or Apple TV, if that is upsetting you, the Pac-12 network should upset you more. The bottom half, Oregon obviously doesn't apply in this particular point, but the bottom half of the conference would look at Apple TV or Amazon as being the streaming partner instead of the Pac-12 network and say, yippee-ki-yay, because that's going to be a bigger audience for us than it was before. For other schools, maybe not as much, but we don't actually know. Like you don't know. Oregon, Washington was, I think, the most viewed game, excluding USC and UCLA. I saw Dennis Dodd tweet out the numbers, and it was like 3.53 million. If that game were on Amazon Prime and got 2.8 million instead, is that radically shifting the direction of the program? No, not, not really. And the Pac-12 network, which has been a mess just from a distribution standpoint, Apple and Amazon, either one, I think represents a better option on that front. And I don't think that that's particularly close. So bringing it back to the original question here, what is my dream scenario for the Pac-12 and its new media deal? Be in the ballpark of the Big 12 and the ACC from a per-team media rights revenue distribution standpoint. Have a cable partner, though I don't know that it's like totally essential. It kind of is, kind of isn't, but have a cable partner, probably ESPN, and I'd be fine with one or both of Amazon and Apple. I think it's probably easier for the conference to just have one, but if you have to go to two in order to get closer to the numbers that the other conferences have gotten to this point, then I think you do that. And this is a question that you always have to ask yourself when thinking about this sort of stuff. And I talked about this the other day on my Pac-12 show. Do you value money or being on linear television? Like, if you were forced to choose between having ESPN as part of the deal, but only bringing in $25 million per school per year, or being on, exclusively on Apple or Apple, Amazon hybrid, whatever, right? Or like 90% streaming, but you were coming in at $34 million per year above the Big 12, which I'm not saying is a possibility, but I'm just trying to speak to everybody's mindset here. Which one would you rather have? I think you can argue either side. I really think you can. I would lean towards the financial element of it because the actual number of people that watch the games, yeah, it affects your viewership or it affects your ability to get into homes across the country at some level. But is it changing it dramatically enough to where no one's going to have ever heard of your program or you don't play in games that people watch or anything like that? Because you have to remember, if you play a home and home series, well, people are going to have an opportunity to watch you then if you're so worried about it. And bowl games or college football playoff games, once that expands, I would lean towards the financial side of it. But I understand the exposure factor and, being quote unquote hidden away on streaming, but it's been hidden away in the Pac-12 for a long time. So I think it's at least improving that situation. So that's what my dream scenario would be. Somehow have ESPN as a partner, one of Apple or Amazon, I don't care which, and be able to get in the ballpark of the other media deals. Good question. I love that sort of talk. I am not tired of it yet. I might wear of it eventually. I guarantee I'm not there. So if you have more questions, by all means, let me know. And this is the most important point because here we are in Locked On Ducks. Whatever happens, I'm not that worried about Oregon going forward. I'm really not. Other schools in the Pac-12 will be more concerned. Not that worried about Oregon. Okay. This has been in the mailbag for a while, and I apologize for not getting to it sooner. I need to be better about that. but there were just a lot of questions that came in and news stories that popped up and whatnot. But this came from @duck_blazer with not one, but two great questions. Same number of rings LeBron won in Miami. Hey, Spencer, now that Dan Lanning has recruited, quote, his guys with an emphasis on speed from high school in the portal, do you anticipate he will use that speed by blitzing the quarterbacks more to make them uncomfortable, as well as getting them out of a rhythm? Or do you think he will utilize that speed east and west to cover the sidelines? Thanks for your insight. I don't think schematically Lanning wants to change a lot from the defense last year. There were a lot of identifiable characteristics from last year that were Dan Lanning hallmarks from his time at Georgia in terms of how the defense operated. I think what Dan Lanning wanted to change and has changed significantly is the personnel. And one thing that Lanning became kind of known for at Georgia and used very effectively in that national championship game against Alabama, by the way, to get free runners at Bryce Young, and did it a couple times last year too, were simulated pressures where it looks like you're blitzing more guys than you actually are, but then you kind of drop an end back into coverage. I agree with you that speed is more of an emphasis for Lanning, which doesn't surprise me because a lot of the players, not all, but a lot of the players that were on the roster when he got there were Mario Cristobal guys who's someone that I think prioritizes physicality over speed. Doesn't mean he doesn't want to have fast guys or doesn't have them, but I think it was more a physicality, a physically built team because that was Mario Cristobal's identity. So I agree with you that the speed has become more of an emphasis. I don't think Lanning wants to blitz, as in bringing 5 or more guys, and a simulated pressure is where you bring someone from the second level, basically, whether it's a defensive back or a linebacker, but you're still only rushing 4, but it looks to the quarterback like you're bringing more than that. I don't think Lanning wants to blitz with 5 or more guys more than he did in 2022. And that's a conversation that he and Tosh Lupoy, now Chris Hampton, are all going to have to be a part of. I think he wants to have more team speed because he thinks it'll improve their coverage prospects, which I agree with, by the way. There were times where it just felt like Oregon was kind of just out-athleted from a speed standpoint and an agility standpoint at a number of positions. And by the way, who was the defensive transfer that Oregon brought in at a position in which speed is important? Christian Gonzalez, going to be a first-round pick. I think that's what Lanning and Lupoy are going for here, is not giving up the size element or bringing guys who are just going to be really, really fast, right? Like the Chip Kelly teams were all about speed, and they really didn't have a lot of size. They recruited smaller offensive linemen who were quicker and could move. They recruited smaller defensive linemen who could move. And that was really true all the way through the second level on the back end of the defense. Like, they didn't have a lot of big, physically imposing guys compared to the sorts of players we've seen roll through with the Cristobal recruiting classes over the last several years. They had a lot of speed, right? John Boyette had a lot of speed. You even go back like Walter Thurman, Jarris Burt. They were skinnier guys who were very speed oriented. I think Lanning is going for something a little bit in the middle because that's what the SEC has always had, right? Is they've had that high-end speed, but they haven't forfeited the size and physicality. And I think those are the sorts of players like Justin Jacobs, for instance, the linebacker, that he is going for. Speaking of linebackers, by the way, I just have to throw this in there. As I've talked about that position group over the last couple of weeks, I think I just a couple times have neglected Keith Brown more than I should have, because I really like what he showed in the Holiday Bowl, and frankly, in the snaps that we saw of him last year, just name to watch out for on that front going forward. But anyway, I do think Lanning and Lupoy both recognize what I have talked about and what you all saw last year too, and that's there wasn't enough pressure on the quarterback. I don't think Lanning wants to have to bring extra guys from the second level to do that. That's why you bring in a Jordan Birch to complement Brandon Dorlus and Casey Rogers. And you look at all the defensive linemen that he's bringing in, Mateo Uyunglele, of course. That is, I think, the biggest shift for Lanning from last year to this year that he's going for. But I think the speed element and going after guys like Roderick Pleasant and landing them is because he looked at the team last year and said, sometimes Washington game, for instance, felt like they were just a little bit faster, right? Like, who were the guys that were having the most trouble in that game, right? Bennett Williams had a rough game. Great run stopper. Doesn't have high-end speed. And I think that's something that they want to change. So I like that question. I don't think they're going to blitz more. I think they just feel like they've upgraded their personnel, which I agree with, by the way, to the point where they're going to be able to generate more pressure without having to do that. Because you don't want to have to bring players out of the second level, but you do want to have guys who are capable of doing that. Like Bossa was a really fast linebacker last year, and he blitzed quite a bit. And I think that is the sort of player from a speed standpoint that Lanning and company want to have. That's the first question. Here's the second one. These are just outstanding questions, Duck Blazer. Really, really good. Again, sorry I didn't get to them a little bit sooner. Hey, Spencer, if the quarterback is the most important position in football because he touches the ball, makes the decisions every down on offense, Oregon needs to go after the best quarterbacks in the country. Hard to disagree with that. What specifically does Oregon need to do to land Dylan Raiola, who's the number one quarterback in 2024? Where does Oregon currently stand, and what are our chances of landing him? Well, the second part of your question is a John Garcia question, who I'm going to do my best to get back on the show for next week. But what does Oregon need to do to land him? I think right now you just are trying to get on his radar in some capacity. And I think the other component here is Will Stein and Bo Nix need to have a really good season. Because when you're a high school quarterback looking at where you want to play college football, who your offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach is going to be, and Will Stein is both, as was Dillingham, that's going to play a major factor. And you could make the argument pretty easily, especially when you look at what happened with Dante Moore. He went to UCLA after Dillingham left because Dillingham was kind of his guy. That was his primary recruiter because that's going to be his position coach, the guy he works with the most. You could argue that that is a Will Stein question. If he comes out and succeeds with Bo Nix this year, because we know he's got all the personnel that he needs. So if he is ready schematically to be at the Power 5 level, then that's part of the recruiting pitch to Dylan Raiola. But he also has to be able to form that relationship, cultivate it, and grow it to a point where Raiola sees Oregon as a legitimate option. I think that's the sort of player that Oregon can get. Like we saw that with Dante Moore. I know he ended up at UCLA, but that's because his coach left. The guy that when I talked to him down in Las Vegas, Dante Moore, that is, and I'd asked him before he'd committed about Oregon, I said, what's your relationship like with Kenny Dillingham? Oh, that's my guy. You got to be able to have that sort of bond with a player if you're Will Stein. And Oregon's got the tools, got the brand power, got the NIL money to attract a guy of that caliber. But that's going to be up to Will Stein. Far more than Dan Lanning, I think. I think quarterbacks are very unique in that sense. And when I get John back on the show, I'll ask him about it and see what he thinks. But I think it's going to be about Stein and the success he has this year and the ability that he shows as a recruiter. Great questions. The mailbag is not totally empty. I think I got a couple questions in there that have been matriculating in. Good big fancy word there to make me sound a lot smarter than I am. I look a lot smarter than I am in this suit too. So I figured, if the shoe fits or if the suit fits, I need to be cut off. Pitch perfect riff off style. So we'll end it there, but keep the questions coming. YouTube and Twitter. Appreciate everyone listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day and go Ducks.